Daniel Ricciardo is just 3 races into a crucial season that was meant to propel him back into a dream Red Bull racing seat, but is instead starting to feel like a repeat of his McLaren nightmare. This has not been the start to 2024 that Ricciardo had been hoping for at Red Bull's second team RB, and not because the team is failing to hold up its end of the bargain. RB started the year broadly where we expected, with a car capable of challenging for the top 10. Yuki Tsunoda finally delivered on that potential in Australia, qualifying 8th and scoring the team's first points of the season by finishing 7th. And it really is Tsunoda leading the charge, as Ricciardo's form is the underwhelming part of the equation. Tsunoda's 3-0 up in qualifying and should be 3-0 up in race finishes too. It was only a team orders call that let Ricciardo beat him in Bahrain, where Tsunoda undermined his good start to the season with his emotional overreaction after the checkered flag, which you probably remember well. In Saudi Arabia, Ricciardo suffered the embarrassment of spinning late in the Grand Prix, and at his home race in Australia, he only qualified 18th after having a lap time deleted for a track limits offence. He cut a baffled and clearly frustrated figure after qualifying in Melbourne in particular, and not just because of that Q1 elimination. When he said he felt that deleted lap was all I had, and was still over a tenth slower than what Tsunoda managed, there were worrying echoes of his difficult years at McLaren. We'll get into that in more detail very shortly, but rather than getting bogged down in his position, it was clearly far more painful to Ricciardo that he simply couldn't be as quick as Tsunoda. Ricciardo admitted he was puzzled that his deleted lap was still not good enough compared to Yuki because it felt like a proper lap, and having punched in 3 poles and many more great qualifying performances during his career, Ricciardo knows what that usually means. But it still wasn't enough, and to make matters worse, he was speaking to the media while qualifying was still going on, and just as Tsunoda put in a blinding Q2 time to make the top 10 for the first time this season. Ricciardo subsequently admitted that even with the track improving, he would have been unable to match that bigger step, which he appeared genuinely concerned by. And at the end of the Melbourne weekend, which finished with Ricciardo 8 seconds outside the points in a lapped 12th, he admitted he had expected a much stronger start to 2024 than this. Given he felt at the limit of the car, Ricciardo wants more checks to be conducted because he's not fully convinced it's working as it should be. It's worryingly similar to his concerns in Monaco back in 2021, when he hit the first nadir of his McLaren stint and felt that car problems must be to blame for his lack of pace. Subsequent checks by McLaren revealed that wasn't the case, and that it was instead all about the way he was driving an admittedly tricky car. That came to dominate the next year and a half, wrecked Ricciardo's confidence, depleted his stock as a driver, and led to him leaving McLaren before the end of his contract. We can't be sure yet whether Ricciardo's facing another fundamental incompatibility with the car, just simply struggling to be as quick as his teammate, or genuinely facing some kind of hidden car problem. He's adamant that he's not in the same situation as McLaren because he feels confident in the car in areas like braking and slow corner entry, which is where he tripped up against Lando Norris. In Australia, for example, much of Ricciardo's Q1 deficit to Tsunoda was down to being unable to carry as much speed through the high-speed turn 9-10 left-right sweep. Ricciardo has generally sounded happy with this team and made some progress during his interrupted part season last year to better suit his style, including improving the mid-corner rotation characteristics. He seemed to clock during the Australia weekend how the narrative had developed, because after the race he was at pains to stress it's not a confidence thing, or a matter of questioning what the hell is this car going to do when I brake or when I turn. It's that he cannot carry the speed he sees that Tsunoda can. But even if the on-track specifics aren't the same as McLaren, what Ricciardo says feels eerily familiar. There's at least a sentiment of lacking answers, even though he says his focus is to stay calm and stay on course, and insists he has the confidence he will find more in himself. Offered the chance in Melbourne to address the question of whether the car characteristics are not as he wants them, Ricciardo pointed to his doubts about the car itself. Ricciardo doesn't believe there are any known differences between his car and Tsunoda's, like for example any kind of weight disparity as can sometimes arise. But he intends to keep asking questions and make sure that I've got something I think is capable. He even got given a full new set of engine components after qualifying in Australia. This is all clearly in the search for some problem that might explain the deficit to Tsunoda and his general struggles. It echoes Ricciardo's sentiments after the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix weekend, which triggered checks that led the team to find some small issues with the car that potentially inhibited his performance, but not by enough to explain his single lap pace deficit to Tsunoda there. RB will doubtlessly take another close look at the car, and it might be there's something still not right that's holding Ricciardo back, but nothing from the team after qualifying or around the race itself indicated this was the case in Australia. He finished the race saying yet again that he hoped RB might yet find something on the car, which has an air of grasping at straws. And given the McLaren years, there's still a big question mark about whether the limitation might just be a driver who's still struggling to get the most out of the car and recapture the sky-high level of his F1 pomp. Ricciardo simply hasn't had the start to the season he needs, and pressure is building after Red Bull Motorsport advisor Helmut Marko's recent comments that Ricciardo needs to raise his game. That's disappointing given the hopes he could set himself on a trajectory that would allow him to get back to his best in F1, an outcome that feels more distant now than it has at any point since he returned to F1 midway through last year. Red Bull started the season knowing that it had several options for Max Verstappen's teammate in 2025. Incumbent Sergio Perez has always appeared to be the number one choice. At least that was implied when Red Bull team principal Christian Horner described that seat as Checo's to lose. But Perez is out of contract at the end of 2024, so really he has as much to prove as anybody, especially after he went missing for so much of 2023 and Verstappen could have won Red Bull both titles single-handedly. Then factor in Ricciardo being something of a Horner pet project, for it was Horner who led the charge for Ricciardo's return, and his immense marketability, and his good relationship with Verstappen, and it looked like Red Bull had a tailor-made Perez replacement if it needed one. But Ricciardo's not doing the business. Perez was until Melbourne, where he struggled as well. That might have been a handy reprieve for Ricciardo had ex-Red Bull Junior Carlos Sainz not won the Grand Prix and then earned praise from Horner, who more than hinted that free agent Sainz was on the team's radar for 2025 given he's being released by Ferrari. It's also worth considering where Verstappen's future and the potential availability of Fernando Alonso fits into this. Verstappen's been heavily linked with a Red Bull exit amid the power struggle between the team's leadership figures. Were Verstappen to go, Alonso is believed to be viewed as a realistic alternative for Red Bull, which might explain why Horner seemed to be threatening to call Verstappen's bluff when the prospect of Verstappen walking away became such a prominent talking point during the Saudi Arabian Grand Prix weekend. Alonso would likely jump at the chance to join the dominant team of this F1 era, but he probably needs Verstappen to walk away to get that opportunity. The other thing Red Bull needs to consider in all this is whether or not Ricciardo's worth keeping Liam Lawson on the sidelines for. Last year's stand-in success is a looming threat to Ricciardo. The 3-2 driver problem was resolved in Ricciardo's and Tsunoda's favour for 2024, but Red Bull has promised to find Lawson a race seat no later than 2025. It's an interesting subplot in the broader Red Bull power dynamic. Ricciardo is Horner's man, Tsunoda is there for Honda, and Lawson's the driver Marko seems to really rate, and wanted in the seat for 2024 after he did well replacing Ricciardo last year. But Marko didn't get his wish, and he's been putting pressure on Ricciardo and Tsunoda to a lesser degree for a reason. It seems more than likely that what Marko wants is to get Lawson into an RB seat one way or another, and at this rate it would have to be Ricciardo that makes way. The question is whether it ever gets to that dramatic a point, whether Horner or the RB bosses or Red Bull's parent company see it that way, or maybe whether Ricciardo himself says, I really don't fancy going through another year of this again. That doesn't sound like the case from Ricciardo's side, as he insists his focus and his motivation is unchanged, but the rumours have already started. There was a suggestion in the Melbourne paddock that Ricciardo might be facing something of an ultimatum, a line the New Zealand Herald newspaper is now pushing. It would be very drastic if the situation was as simple as Ricciardo having until Miami in May to turn things around or be replaced, but there's at least a little pressure building to improve. One curiosity in all this is the guy who's beating Ricciardo might not get much out of it. At the start of the year, we were wondering whether Tsunoda and Ricciardo could end up cannibalising each other's careers. Tsunoda's never seemed to have Red Bull's confidence, as Marko says it was concerned by his self-control outbursts and error proneness. So if Ricciardo looked anything less than stunning against Yuki, it would count for nothing. But as there have been so many doubts about Ricciardo as well, Tsunoda edging him wouldn't necessarily move the needle either. It just seemed possible that a likely outcome, not even just a plausible one, was 2024 ending with Red Bull shrugging its shoulders at both of them. Maybe that won't come to pass. Australia was a really good response from Tsunoda to Marko's hurry up, and Marko then praised Tsunoda effusively afterwards. But we still doubt Tsunoda's got a realistic shot at a Red Bull racing seat in the future. While Marko seems to have a soft spot for his speed, there are the frustrations about the emotional outbursts, and Horner's clearly not won over. He even turned a question about whether Red Bull should take Tsunoda more seriously as an option into an answer about Carlos Sainz in Australia, claiming Red Bull wants to field the best pairing that we can, so might need to look outside its current driver pool. So Tsunoda might find himself just seat warming until his main backer Honda leaves the Red Bull teams for Aston Martin in 2026. When that happens, he seems extremely unlikely to stay on Red Bull's books, unless something dramatically changes or he does win the team's bosses over. Tsunoda hasn't given up on doing that, but the best thing he can do now is make his case for any drive as strong as possible. There have been times it's been hard to imagine anyone else picking Tsunoda up, but at his best, he is clearly worthy of a spot on the grid. Tsunoda said that he wants to increase his value as an F1 driver, and conquering Ricciardo is the best way to do that. It still might not be enough for Tsunoda to transform his own fate, but it would surely wipe away the last remaining bit of stock that Ricciardo still has.